Okay. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining the Against Nature Roundtable event put on by Union Hall. My name is Esther H. Lee, and also known as Esther Hernandez. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the chief curator at Union Hall. And if you're listening from afar and you don't know about Union Hall, we are a small nonprofit contemporary art event space in Denver, Colorado. We primarily support the work of emerging artists within our exhibitions and emerging curators through our Rough Gems program. Rough Gems is our annual open call curatorial program where emerging curators can submit exhibition proposals for consideration. And if they're selected and awarded, they're awarded funding and exhibition space and mentorship. So each year we're able to host 3 Rough Gems exhibitions, and Against Nature is the 3rd exhibition for 2023. And then this year, at the end of the Rough Gems programming, we are hosting a closing party that happens to be on Earth Day on April 22nd. So if you're interested in that, you can get tickets on our website, where it should be really fun. We'll have a DJ, drinks, and things like that. And one last thing, with that being said, none of this would be possible without support from our sponsors. And so I just want to give a quick shout out to the Coloradan Community Foundation, the Andy Warhol Foundation, Colorado Creative Industries, and the Bonfils Stanton Foundation. And without further ado, I would like to briefly introduce Shawn Simmons, who is our current curator for this Rough Gems exhibition titled Against Nature, and will be moderating the roundtable event tonight. Shawn is an art historian and an educator, and he has recently completed a thesis on queer ecological arts practices in relation to futurism and utopia. So it's been a pleasure to work with Shawn, and we're really excited that to be able to host this exhibition. So thank you, Shawn.
Great. Thank you, Esther, and Emma and Jess and the whole Union Hall team for making this happen. And I'm super, super, super excited to have been able to pull this group together tonight from different states and different time zones for this conversation. So again, my name is Shawn Simmons. I use he, him pronouns. I'm an art historian and researcher, currently joining from my graduate student office at the University of Colorado Boulder, located on the unceded territories of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations. And in the interest of time, there's a lot more information on bios and background and et cetera, for all of our artists on the exhibition website. But I am just going to have us kind of go around and share maybe names, pronouns, where you're joining us from. The artist first, and then I'll go ahead and introduce Nicolas from the Institute of Queer Ecology. So let's maybe just alphabetical order. I'll start with Dennis.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dennis Doyle. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm joining from Boulder, Colorado.
Eden next.
Hi, folks. My name is Eden Kincaid, they, them, and I am joining from Tucson, where I am a geographer, human geographer.
And Corinne.
Hi, y'all. I'm Corinne Teed. I'm here from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'm an artist. Nice to see you all.
And I guess that is me. Hello, I'm Frankie Tone. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm joining from Denver.
Beautiful. Thank you all. And we are pleased to welcome Nicolas Baird, co-director of the Institute of Queer Ecology, who we are working pretty closely together with on programming for this exhibition. I guess I'll plug right now, we're going to have a screening of Metamorphosis, which is a film of IQ Eco's in person at the gallery at Union Hall on Tuesday, April 18th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. There is a registration link for that event on the exhibition website as well, and I'm sure I'll continue kind of plugging that throughout the talk, but that's something to look forward to coming up. I'll read sort of the official statement from the Institute of Queer Ecology, and then sort of as our special guest, I'll turn it over to Nicolas to introduce himself. He's not only a guest in this conversation, but he's visiting from New York and was able to get a walkthrough of the whole exhibition this morning. So we'll likely have some questions for the artists. The Institute of Queer Ecology is an ever-evolving collaborative organism that seeks to bring peripheral solutions to environmental degradation to the forefront of public consciousness. IQ Eco projects are interdisciplinary, but unified and grounded in the theoretical framework of queer ecology, an adaptive practice concerned with interconnectivity, intimacy, and multi-species relationality. The Institute of Queer Ecology was founded in 2017 by Lee Pivnik while he was studying at the Rhode Island School of Design. It is co-directed by Nicolas Baird, who joined the project shortly after its inception and has continued to steer its growth and focus. And Nick, I'll turn that over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Shawn and Esther and Jess and the rest of the team at Union Hall. And also, like, what an honor and pleasure to be in conversation with all of you today. It's such a beautiful show, and I'm also here with my feline friend, so apologies if we keep getting visits from him, but I think this is a good audience for that. But no, I'm super excited to talk about the work that I got to see this morning, and like it very much resonates with the work that the Institute has been doing. And yeah, I'm really, again, it's an honor and a delight to be here. I'm Nicolas, he, him. I'm from Arizona originally, actually very close to Tucson, Eden. I grew up in Oracle. But I live in New York now, and I'm visiting Colorado for a short period of time to get to see the show and some other like nature, mostly get out of the city for a little while. But I'm working on my doctorate right now in paleontology, and I'm trying to figure out whether I'm an artist or a writer or a dancer or a scientist. So that's all in process.
Great. All right. Well, with that, I think we'll get going. Esther, if you want to start those slides just rolling in the background. And thank you to Ray Munoz for the wonderful photography that's of the exhibition that's going to be playing throughout our conversation. But just, I think maybe to start us off with some background on, how I conceptualized this exhibition. This is a topic that's been pretty near and dear to me throughout my master's thesis. As an art historian, I have a background in queer contemporary work, more specifically looking at art of AIDS and the aftermath. And more recently, that's turned into explicitly queer ecological themes. And thinking about the title of this exhibition as Against Nature, I think I was really trying to communicate that we're looking to alternatives, right, to these traditional notions of environmentalism, traditional notions of what makes, this human versus nature dichotomy. I first really, got involved in this topic I cite this all the time in talking about queer ecology, but this really groundbreaking volume from 2010 by the environmental studies scholar, Kate Sandilands, who argues that the mainstream categorizes queerness as fundamentally against nature. Sorry, I'm looking at my curatorial statement right now. And so queer ecology then offers this alternative. It argues for cooperation rather than competition between species, and offers ultimately a successful model for the future. And so that sense of sort of utopian longing has very strong roots and very strong footing in queer theory, something that I've been drawn to for a very long time, and a thread that I really think connects a lot of the work in this show that you'll hear more about through this conversation. And of course, those with stronger science backgrounds are more qualified to talk about all of this than I am, and I know some of you do. I also first connected with this through what Sandilands describes as melancholy nature. And Corinne, one of Corinne's works in the show, actually cites that essay as kind of an impetus for feral utopias. And so I was super, super excited and knew that that had to be included. But just sort of in bridging my own background, the connection between queer mourning and environmental mourning is something that I have found really powerful as a theme throughout this. And I've also just been sort of profoundly moved by nature's role in healing, both kind of individual and collective trauma, and in sort of orienting us toward the future in a shockingly optimistic way, in a topic that sort of deals with so much doom and gloom. Yeah, and so I think that's the short version, just to stay on time. We have a lot of folks participating in this conversation, which I'm excited about. But I think I'll turn it over, just the first question, to Nicolas, as sort of an outside set of eyes who didn't get to see the exhibition until this morning. If you have any sort of burning questions or impressions that you'd like to sort of kick off our conversation with, we'd love to hear them.
Like 10,000. But I think, I don't know, I walked through this morning and we got to spend a good, maybe an hour looking at each of the works and sort of seeing them in dialogue with each other. And one of the things that came up, Frankie, in your statement that I think sort of speaks to all of your practices, and I'm sort of interested to hear what you have to say in response to this question, which is also a very dear question to my own heart. But Frankie, you say something about the sort of allowing the non-human agendas, or like I would sort of also in my own work call them like more than human, or thinking about things like beyond the human sphere. But using the word agenda is such anyway, I wanted to know how and what non-human or more than human agendas are speaking through your works, in particularly the show, but maybe more in general in your practices. I know that's like there's like 4 of you, and it's a very broad question. But if anyone feels up to diving in that way,
I can sort of start to answer that question in the sense of, I think a lot of I have a background as a soft sculptor, and I have often found a lot of my sculptures and installation work to be sort of its own form of community making, and trying to have these pieces be in conversation and kind of in a living dialogue with each other. And as my work has progressed, excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. As my work has progressed away from more human-based imagery and more into the natural world, I have kind of opened up those doors in my own studio practice and within the installation to have it be just, something where there's, the worms are all kind of crawling on each other and they're cohabitating in these dirt piles, but so are these like super inorganic, unnatural materials that everything's made out of. So I think to me, I see it as a conversation more than just about the imagery or what, the flowers or things like that, but also the materiality of the pieces as well. So yeah, I'll start with that.
cool, thank you. I love those shiny vinyl earthworms. So like, yeah, the materiality of those are really like does something to me.
They're very juicy.
I just have to note also, getting to install those in the gallery, and Esther helped with this as well, was such a joy, because Frankie, I mean, as you know, your work is just like, as humans, we are tactile people, and we're drawn to wanting to touch really fun, shiny vinyl things. And so it felt like getting to break the rules in a really fulfilling and wonderful way, to get to actually touch these flowers and, install them onto the pieces. Yeah, it was a really kind of wonderful sensory experience. And I know it's definitely hard for children visiting the gallery to keep hands off of those, but people have gotten such joy from it. So
yeah. And I mean, that's one of those things too, like I've done installations at children's museums and things like that, where I like to break down the rules of the gallery as well, but only with permission of the gallery, I guess. And one other thing I'd like to say about that non-human agenda is there's also like a rift in that on the gay agenda or the queer agenda. And a lot of my work has been, I think the agenda comes across pretty clearly in a lot of it. And so this is, is about letting the agenda of other things come through.
I really like that language of agenda and like thinking about the root of that, like the gay agenda comes from Republicans talking about the like I don't know the words to use there because it's all so heated right now, but from Republicans like claiming that the gay agenda is here to ruin the culture of the US and thinking about the ways that that has been taken and incorporated into queer life and a queer political stance, and how it's so like it's about culture and relationality and ways of being outside of like heteropatriarchy and capitalism. And I think that's I guess the way my work relates to that question of the more than human agenda is thinking about affective spaces. Like I know we'll get to talking about the utopian in this exhibition and in queer ecology generally, but I think about like creating these like otherworldly collective spaces that have us like feeling and thinking with different orientations to other species in an effort to understand maybe more than human agendas, maybe the ways that we've unconsciously inherited a lot of like colonial frameworks around landscape and species and beingness with others. And I think one of the things I've realized I'm thinking often about with my work is somatics and how we rest in the somatics of a human body in this world, and how even sitting with all the different ways to feel into human and amongst more than humans can help us like reorient. I think there's so much like affective intellectual reorientation that is healing in this world from terrible inheritances. So yeah, that went a lot of places, but I guess I think mostly I'm thinking a lot about affective spaces in the more than human agenda. And I have decades of like feeling with mushrooms and burrows and other species.
It seems also like the materiality in a different way is playing a role, like particularly in the Burroughs piece where you have the video on the wall and the prints that are sort of creating the space of the burrows. That like those two very different media are speaking to each other in the way that like the work then becomes the like imagined burrow rather than like the individual prints or the individual video in like this sort of like mutual community space affect idea. I'm going to stop saying nouns now. But I see that too in the materiality, like the medium of the works that you've put up in the show.
Yeah, I think that word agenda is really interesting because it always, for me, has such like a more like utilitarian, like really like high function use that like you have an agenda as a means to an end. There's some sort of like idea of like a practical outcome when in it you think about an agenda. But I think in this sort of like more than human agenda or sort of like queer agenda, that it's almost like this anti-agenda that is like not about some sort of like capitalistic outcome. It's about pleasure, it's about relationality. And that I think artwork specifically sort of takes sometimes maybe what we could think of as like practical materials or functional materials, and like the agenda is like a utopian function. Yeah, and I think in my work, I work a lot thinking about chemistry and chemicals and sort of like the non-living material. and especially thinking about like scent and chemicals as something that transgresses the boundary of the body, and that it's definitely an agenda that is difficult to control. That scent is something that lingers in your hair, on your clothes, on your skin, and sort of working with it in an installation context, it's difficult, and that it spreads out from its original locale. And so it's sort of this material that bobs and moves and weaves through space, not really on an agenda sometimes that I might always wish. And that's sort of like working with that and sort of having, you know, my human agenda come into contact with a chemical agenda. And that is sort of like a working through and a making sort of a collaborative agenda together.
Okay, I wasn't going to say anything again, but I just thought of the sort of the piece that you have with the tube connections of the scent chambers, or the sort of air chambers in the show. For viewers who haven't seen it yet, you encase yourself in a sort of like small room and exchange gas with a small room of burned wood. Correct me if I'm wrong. But it to me, it really gives agency back to this sort of like dead, non-human or other thing, in like a way that really like you're exchanging gas and it's this sort of equalizer. But that even then thinking about that, I'm thinking about the word agency and agenda, and the relationships there between like the like things to be done and the ability to do, or the ability to be. You know, there's something there that needs to be worked out.
I wanted to jump in and add one thing I was thinking about as part of the more than human agendas coming through. One of the readings that for me has been really central to my work is Mel Chen's Animacies, which is a 2010 book that's it's like biopolitical racial imaginings and queer affect. I don't remember the subtitle, but that book deals a lot with hierarchies of Western capitalism and using a queer ecology framework to disrupt those. And that feels really essential to the more than human agenda. As a guide, I think that work has been a big guide to me.
I think, thank you all for those responses. I think keep moving through. And just as a reminder, so I didn't necessarily go over the structure of this conversation, but we have about one or two more kind of formal questions to work through. But please, as we're talking, feel free to, if you're tuning in on YouTube, to drop any questions in that chat, and we'll have time for an audience Q&A at the end of the event. And so this has been hinted at by a couple of you, and sort of a through line for me in imagining this exhibition and putting it together is this sense of utopianism, and how that maybe does or does not shine through in different facets of queer ecology. And, you know, I think my greatest insecurity and greatest like fear in a curatorial position is speaking for anyone. And so I talk a lot about this sense of speculative utopia, about imagining futures. But more recently in conversations with people, I've been thinking, you know, that's not what everyone thinks about this work. And while a lot of the ways that I'm approaching it feels very sort of optimistic, and, you know, is imagining these radical queer futures, some of it is really dark in the subject matter that it's dealing with. And so I think the question I want to open to you is, do you find that queer ecology, and maybe more specifically your practice, reflects this sense of utopian longing that I'm speaking about? And that is such a tradition in queer theory. I'm thinking of Jose Munoz and Lauren Berlant and Jack Halberstam, science fiction, things like Octavia Butler. I'm curious if you find that to be present in the field, and how you sort of approach that notion of utopia within your own individual practice.
I can speak. Yes, I think for me, that's very much a kind of through line, both in terms of intellectually and also, my own arts practice. This kind of utopia kind of yearning is there. And of course, it's complex in the sense that I think it largely emerges from the fact that queer and trans people's possibility and lives are foreclosed in a lot of terrible ways. So for me, both intellectually, this kind of thinking, but also these kind of arts practices that focus on utopia are a way to kind of give some space to that yearning, and to imagine a queer space or a different place or a different kind of set of relations or a different kind of set of conditions for all life, but queer and trans life in particular. So I think in my own work, this is certainly visible. I do a lot of this work kind of as a geographer and kind of in a kind of realm of theory, but I think art is really a way to try to find a space in which to kind of break with these kind of dominant logics and systems of oppression, and find some space in which to, relate to ourselves and others differently, and to kind of sketch out a different sort of grammar of, sensibility and like meaning making. So in the case of my work, one of my pieces in here, Queer Landscape, is very much concerned with, landscape is a kind of genre and a kind of concept in geography that's been kind of sutured to colonial projects and to kind of white male gaze. I'm trying to locate some other kind of imaginary of landscape or kind of visuality of landscape that would, show us maybe other worlds. I think a lot of these images have this kind of utopian moment to them. But it's a complex utopian moment, right? It's also marked by foreclosure and impossibility and kind of brokenness in a certain way, incompleteness, which I think all these queer utopias are very kind of held in that tension. And then I'd say the other piece that I have in here, the portrait series, is kind of in a different sense, working through this kind of tension as well, trying to find a place within this kind of dominant ordering and dominant logic that, portrays transness as a kind of outsider kind of aberration. Looking for an affective space and a kind of relational space in which other modes of being are possible.
I love to talk about utopias. I love that Jose Munoz piece. I reread it all the time because I teach it all the time. And I think about it with my students all the time, which is like always like thinking about utopias' inherent connection to dystopias, like that you exist in a dystopia that helps define your utopia, and that like it always feels unreachable. It's always like the horizon beyond. And I think one of the reasons that Munoz is so helpful in thinking particularly about queer ecology is, he takes all this time in the beginning to explain his investment in concrete utopias, and like thinking from an angle of Marxism and thinking through materiality and like material realities, and that it's in like, you can't, for him, the politics of queer utopias like can't be severed from those material realities. And I think about like all of this work about thinking with material realities and ones that it's often hard to get a clear picture of in this like very dishonest world about what the planet and other species are going through, and that like being materially with those complications and like figuring out how to relate in a dystopic utopic framework, like the recognizing the dystopia allows for the definitions of the utopias. They feel so intertwined, and that feels part of queer ecology. Like I think there's an aspect of it that's so much against the kind of sterilization, purification of the idea of nature, and like thinking about nature as this like humanless, wilderness that is just pure from any influence of human, like really destroying those myths and those separations, and thinking with the material realities and all the kind of interrelational complexities that define the dystopia feels so essential to queer ecology, and such an interruption, such an agenda.
Word of the day, absolutely. That just got me thinking. I was presenting some research in a symposium recently and was asked the great question that stumped me for a second of, you're talking a lot about utopia. Why aren't you talking about dystopia? And this sort of incredibly blurry line between the two of them and how they're being approached in queer ecological arts practices. And I was like, because no one wants to talk about dystopia. That's not necessarily a fun aspect to talk about. But yeah, I think I keep sort of coming back to this kind of queer theoretical literature and looking at the sort of the nature of world building that it's founded upon. And that's what makes me classify this as utopia, as sort of building a world from the ground up. Jack Halberstam has recently talked a lot about unworlding or unbuilding as this sort of radical abolitionist practice of tearing down systems in order to rebuild them from the ground up. And that's sort of an aspect that I've been applying visually to these practices and thinking of how are they taking what exists in the present, reevaluating what has existed in the past, and then trying to create this new radical, exciting, it's a word I keep reverting to, but exciting future of queer existence and relationality. If anyone else wants to hop on that question as well.
When I was thinking about my work in relationship to utopia, the first thought I had was that a lot of this for me is more of like a coping mechanism. And I think the utopian ideal for me within it is like, so this series, The Queer Gardens, is this ongoing series that just, I build a new garden at the time of the show. And so there are pieces that are old and pieces that are new, and they keep, coming up and being placed and built in different ways, and new ways and old ways. And for me, it's also a practice of like trying to get out of my own way. The idea of like trying to allow a non-human or a more than human agenda within the work is also like trying to like not be a human, which maybe someday I'll figure out how to not be a human, or I'll be a cyborg, or I'll be something. But I think for me, it is this practice of trying to, sort of as Corinne was saying, like leave these frameworks that we've inherited behind and try to be more of a conduit for something else. And it's, natural frameworks are the ways we relate to nature, but also to these other hierarchies of capitalism and colonialism and all of those kinds of things. So for me, I do think of it as a coping mechanism, but I think there's those utopian ideals in there as well.
Yeah, and I think in so much of the work in the show, I think just like this, I think in both ways, like the scale of a lot of the work is sort of reaches sort of like a human body scale, and that so much of the work is performative, or sort of activates the body. Thinking about like Eden's work and Corinne's Burroughs piece in the back, and sort of these moments where like utopia exists within the site of the body as well. And that I think that utopia can be this way of like acting out or sort of reimagining what a future could be with the materials that are in the present. And so it's sort of like taking this sort of materiality and sort of recasting it to think about a different future that can sort of exist right at the locale of the body. I think is like such like a beautiful through line in the show, or even sort of like walking through the gardens as, you know, that your body is now existing materially inside of the space. Yeah, and I think like the materiality of utopia is really interesting, and that I think that idea of that Munoz talks about, that Corinne was mentioning, of concrete utopia that sort of has this sort of material basis that has that connection to the present or is really informed by the past. Yeah, I think a lot about in my work, idea of like in like a permanently ecologically damaged future or different future. How do you still cite desire and pleasure and intimacy in the face of something like toxicity? Yeah, and so my work sort of moving with the idea of death or toxicity as sort of a moment of pleasure or intimacy or contact with another body, that I think art provides us a way of making meaning more so than making sense of things. And so sort of observing the world around you and finding ways to sort of make meaning from that, I think is like really critical just as survival in the day-to-day.
Oh, there, I'm unmuted. I want to ask Nicolas, just while we're on the subject, maybe for folks who are a little bit less versed in IQ Eco's work, especially because, you know, we're showing it as special programming for part of this exhibition. Does that sense of utopianism sort of work as a framing device in IQ Eco's practice, or how have you seen that emerge, or how have you used that maybe as a tool in developing the work?
Which sense of utopianism? No, sorry, it's a silly question. There's so many, but yeah, definitely. I mean, it's something that we're thinking about. I think the Institute works as a sort of collaborative, like very amorphous collective, where each project that we take on is a different set of people, like very different set of people for all the works that we do. And that sort of like malleability but particularly the like working together is like very, there's like an incredible joy in collaboration, I think. And also like speaking from the bias of being part of a collective group that like does this. So I think that that collaborative joy is a part of utopian building. And that like utopia comes from like that. I think like Jose Esteban Munoz has come up so many times and will always come up when we're talking about utopias, rightly so. It describes queerness and also utopias separately as being processes of becoming. Like they're not a destination, but rather like the act of being and becoming other. And I think that sort of like transformation, the mutability, I guess, of that, like that process of transformation, of like becoming, is really important as like an individual artist joining a collective, working as a group, joining like a community, a utopia, and like then returning into the like the individual and the body. But I see that sort of, maybe to like zoom back or zoom in again, that sort of like transformative process is, I see it really activated in the show, actually. Now that I'm thinking about it, a lot of the works have to do with transformation, maybe not necessarily of like the physical body, but of materiality in some ways, of transference and like alchemy. That is, yeah, that's something that maybe I have my like mutability blinders on, or like my mutability tinted glasses on today. But it seems to me like the work is also about transformation and so much about like thinking about, dreaming about utopias. One last little thing, there's this really beautiful, Precious Okoyomen is an artist who does these beautiful installations, and they, in a talk recently, I heard them say like the sort of, they agree with this sort of idea that Jack Halberstam was discussing of like, in order to build a utopia, you first have to like work on the unbuilding, and not necessarily in these terms, but maybe unbuilding the dystopia. But that if you don't put in that process of like just the simple act of dreaming now, then when the utopia or the future is built, then the dream like then is built in a way that lives outside of your dream. And that like, so the practice of becoming and the doing and the transforming is like a practice of dreaming too, of the utopia. Like that the doing and being are like inherent to the practice.
Thank you. And wonderful to hear the words of Precious as well. Incredible, incredible artist, working with these themes and lots of other tangential themes as well. Okay, moving along, I think I'll move into our last discussion point for these prepared questions, and then we'll move into the Q&A from there. And of course, as an art historian, I'm always curious about how we move forward, particularly in a discipline that's very much rooted in the past. I'm interested in sort of bringing these things forward, and particularly with such a future-oriented subject as queer ecology. I'm curious for your thoughts on how the representation and exploration of queer ecology in visual art might evolve in the coming years, or maybe well into the future, and what are maybe some potential directions you see it taking? I know that's a challenging question, but I guess I'm challenging you to dream what these practices could lead to in the near or distant future.
I realized I wanted to say something about dystopia that I think is related to that question, which is like I think Feral Utopias has utopia in the title, but I actually think it's a quite dystopic piece. I think it's really sad. I think people are talking about experiences of alienation based on immigration experiences, racism, queerness, just like so many things happening, and living in a binary society. Like, I think there's a lot of pain that comes out in that piece, and it feels like really talking about the dystopic realities that we live in, and I think it's meant to be kind of a dream world of imagining beyond them, but there's tension in that, like, the people never interact, like it's hard to get there. It's not giving you the place that we've gotten to yet. And I guess when I think about the future of queer ecology, I think it's in the Mortimer Sandilands piece, but I'm not sure. I think one of the things I've thought a lot about is how, like, there's so few like rituals of mourning, that there's we live in a time of great loss, and it's happening on many levels if you're thinking about loss related to queer ecology. And I think about how hard it is to find the spaces to be in the space of that loss. And living in Minneapolis during the uprising after George Floyd's murder, like there was a very serious public space that was about loss and rage and response. And it was I think it was felt in other places too. But thinking about, I think for me, the future of queer ecology has to do with the collective and what we're capable of in collective spaces in terms of like transforming through collectives. And I think sometimes that can happen in the gallery or in the project or in the street. I don't know the sites of it, but I think that to me, it's about collective conversation and change.
I just want to say, Corinne, that was like really beautiful. I loved the idea of thinking about mourning and ritual. Yeah, and I think, that's for me too, and thinking about like the future of queer ecology, definitely thinking about it. Just thinking of it collectively and sort of letting that guide what's needed in the present and how we have to think about the future as things adapt. And I think too, I was really thinking a lot about when we like first introduced ourselves and everyone's sort of confusion in terms of what their label was, like, are you artist, are you geographer, are you professor or scientist? And I think I want more of that. I want more blurry lines and sort of confusion in terms of who you are. And I think too, like, incredible access to these ideas and this sort of way of living that for me, so many like queer ecological, artistic, affective moments, so many of those happen not when I'm in the studio, not when I'm in a gallery space. And it's important to me to like be receiving, you know, baking bread for someone, and that the microbes on my skin are now sort of embedded into that material, and that's sort of a ecological practice that I get to share with someone else. That these aren't like this isn't an institution that is an academic term that is like a barrier to people, that this is sort of a way of living and something you can access in your daily life, whether you make what you think of as traditional artwork or not. I think that's what I want, just those like really blurry lines and sort of getting to be in that blurred boundary with other people.
So I was very blessed to be involved in some very interesting conversations when I was in Denver around the time of the opening at our geography conference, where queer ecologies has just suddenly come up, I guess, which has been very interesting. So it's interesting to kind of track between this kind of art space and more kind of humanities, and then how it's kind of emerging in geography. But one thing that came up in one of our panels was I would like to see queer ecologies be more intersectional. I think one thing that's really cool about queer ecologies is my friend geographer Sage Bryce describes it very neatly when they say that it's queer ecologies kind of tracks this circuit between how what we consider natural informs what's normal in our kind of social world, and that creates this kind of circuit that oppresses queer and trans people, obviously, but also all other minoritized people, right? It's racial logic, it's a colonial logic. So in geography, I think the conversation is very white, and some of the audience members, you know, pushed us to think about what the intersections of Black ecologies and like Latinx environmentalisms and indigenous ecologies and relational thinking are. So I'm excited to try to bring some people together to think across those resonances to more centrally think about race and colonialism and things like that. Because I think queer and trans are these very capacious terms that can talk about social difference writ large, but I think we have to be careful not to overextend them and use them in such a way that doesn't allow for space for thinking more intersectionally.
Yeah, I think when I think about the future of queer ecology, and maybe this is also just when I think about my future, the things that I am hoping to see more of, I think that centering of pleasure that you've kind of touched on, Dennis, I think, and the pleasure being out, you know, with one's body, but also outside of just the human to human interaction. I also think about change. I think, again, when I was talking about my work as sort of a coping mechanism, it is like there's a lot of that fear and terror of what is happening right now, and the feeling of, I guess, yeah, thinking about going back to the utopian question is also, where do fear and terror line up with utopia, and is there a place for that within utopia, or is that the driving force that gets us there? I think I hope to act less out of fear and terror, make less out of fear and terror, but I think that is a central part of my practice and my reality right now. And then I think the other thing that is big for me is this idea of connection to things larger than ourselves, and feeling that, not feeling alone in that connection, feeling inspired in seeking out those connections and having ways to find those connections. That's what I look forward to in the future of queer ecology.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for chiming in on that. It's again, it's as with so much with this subject, it's heartening to hear sort of the directions things are going, the direction things have gone in even the recent history of, you know, ecologically engaged art. And yeah, in dealing with such strife and difficulty, it's wonderful to see, you know, what you've been able to churn out in these times. I think we will turn, once again, we're gonna turn over to the Q&A section. If you're tuning in on the YouTube, Jess has started sending in some questions that actually I think we just covered in that question that I posed to all of you. I'm wondering the group's thoughts on utopia and dystopia as a binary in a literal sense. Are the pieces in this show one or the other or something else? With a follow-up question of, do you believe utopia can be achieved? And if so, what is the path there? Also, y'all have got me thinking about landscape and scent as medium, and it's blowing my mind. So yeah, thinking about the material ecologies of these pieces as well, and how they're you know, making their own statements in the sheer materiality of what's being used in the show. Does anyone want to add thoughts to any of those questions? If not, I have some, while we wait for maybe a couple more to trickle in, I can pose one or two. All right. I will go with, I'm a little bit curious to know, in such sort of an emerging discipline and such an emerging topic that's very interdisciplinary and is pulling from a lot and often hard to keep track of, what are some of the challenges and limitations maybe that you've encountered in working in these areas? And how, you know, have you been able to overcome them, or how might they be able to be overcome, or have they been completely limiting? I'm curious, with such a complex concept, if there have been roadblocks or challenges for your own approach to the work.
I just did something in my like statements or like applications to various things, which is I removed emerging before the concept of queer ecology. And I don't think it's emerging anymore. Like I think Catriona Mortimer Sandilands and Bruce Erickson's book came out in 2010. We're like 13 years in, you know, it's kind of all over the place. And it doesn't feel new in a way. And I'm really curious what other folks think about that. But I like literally this year, I deleted emerging. And this is a great community to think that through with. But I mean, I think what Eden said about intersectionality in queer ecological thinking is really important. Like obviously the human condition is one that is as a vast spectrum of experience. When I talk about inheritances, I'm speaking as a like settler descendant, a white person who has inherited a lot of like settler frameworks and Western science frameworks around other species and relationships and ecosystems. I think that a lot of the like threads in queer ecology are akin to, maybe even like rooted in indigenous epistemologies. And I think about recognizing those intersections or antecedents is like so important in the work. Like it's not, you know, I think like when object theory, when like James Bennett's work came out and so many indigenous communities were like, wait, like rocks have been animate for us this whole time, you know, like I think this idea that we're coming onto something new or new ways of thinking, I always feel cautious around that language, because I think about how like I'm going through a process of transformation where I'm trying to shed in settler inheritances, but I don't know that that's been the lived experience of other communities. And so I think that's a challenging for ecology. And I really like, I think thinking with intersectionality, thinking with like recognizing our place if we are settler descendants and how our experiences may vary or differ, and just being careful not to flatten experiences of marginalization as the same, that like being queer is not the same as being a person of color, and that, you know, like those obviously intersect at times, but when we flatten marginalization, it really does a disservice to lived experience and realities of like oppressive systems. So those are the things that I feel cautious about in the maybe emerging, maybe fully emerged field of queer ecology.
Thanks for that. One thing that I've been kind of puzzling over that came up in all these conversations I was having last month is the place of kind of the biophysical world and science in all this. At least in my experience, you know, a lot of what I read is, you know, in the kind of humanities or this kind of art stuff. And a lot of it is just like the title of the show, you know, positioned against nature. And interested in deconstructing nature as a kind of project and ideology and whatnot. But I had the challenge of reading, I ended up on this panel on Cleo Wolfe-Hazard's new, I don't know how new it is, but Underflows. And he's a river scientist and a performance artist and a field scientist and all kind of things. So that really poked at me. And I actually have training in the natural sciences. So it's funny that I can't make the synthesis happen for myself. But, you know, one thing that he was trying to kind of challenge us to do is really, you know, not just deal with nature as this kind of idea, but to really bring that kind of natural sciences in. So I get really excited when I see people like Dennis, who's a chemist and an artist, and folks who are on my panel who's like doing queer tree ring science and stuff. I get really excited about that, and it blows my mind. So that's something that's, yeah, very much an active area that I'm trying to, you know, understand if we have this whole kind of alienated relation to this idea of nature. Where does that leave ecology, like ecology, not as a metaphor, but as a kind of biophysical reality?
Yeah, I guess to follow up on what Eden was just saying, I think that's definitely like a challenge that I've come up against is I think in using the term like queer ecology, that there's like that direct connection to natural science, and that there's sort of an immediate assumption that people who read about or think about queer ecology come from an explicitly like Western science notion of ecology. And so I think it can then be like challenging, I found, in like working with scientists fairly often, of almost like that question of like what is truth, and that there's this sort of like really objective, in the sciences, objective idea of truth, or sort of like something is factual or provable. And I think when sort of working sort of alongside scientists and sort of doing scientific research myself, and then also producing artwork in response to that I've gotten a lot of pushback on like, well, that isn't necessarily true, but that the work for me is about sort of having of making meaning, of making a utopian thought, or thinking about a future, that artwork and I think queer ecology allows us to sort of reject the sort of Western idea of truth and sort of make meaning in different ways. Yeah, and I think a lot about, sort of reading a lot of scientific papers that are looking at different like, chemical compositions around in the atmosphere around different like industrial sites, and sort of the the need for more measurement as a means of sort of proving ecological harm versus just like listening to people and sort of understanding the effect, really real effects on their bodies and the stories that they have to tell of sort of living in these sites as equal, if not more valid, ecological and environmental information. And I think that can be sort of a challenge that we've sort of rested on this idea of like truth or proof as evidence, that we need evidence versus of understanding like relationality and storytelling as like equal amount of proof.
All right. Question came in from E.T. Bowen that I love and I'm excited to pose to you all. Throughout your experience with this, and I'm assuming in the experience of creating the work that's on display in the show, throughout your experience with this, when did you feel most animalistic?
I'm gonna jump in really quickly because I have to say goodbye. So sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to say goodbye and thank you so much for having me be part of the show. It's been really incredible to see and learn about all of y'all's work, and I'm just really happy to be part of this. So thank you and good night.
Thank you so much, Frankie. And just to repeat that, and this can be a quick answer, however long you'd like to make it. Throughout the experience with creating this work, when did you feel the most animalistic?
I have an obvious answer, which is when I was Goat Boy.
I think in my work, there's a lot of the process that isn't seen. And part of that is like gatherings. So like for Feral Utopias, all the participants came over for dinner and we spent a long time thinking about our inheritances of how we were trained in settler science to think in relationship to other species, and how like we know from a queer perspective, like science has done queer people so wrong and trans people so wrong. And so like, why are we at all have any allegiance to that way of thinking about animals? And I think about like, for me, the ways of like togetherness feels so important to my work that like, for me, it is about relationship. There's a lot of time where I'm alone in the studio, but that can't be everything. Like there has to be some aspect of connecting for me in the process. And I think the two places that I feel most animalistic in that is eating together and on the dance floor. And those feel like when I'm experiencing kind of like somatic community fully. And so like for the Burroughs project, I shared a dance floor with all those people who were in that project at Acre, which is an artist residency in southwestern Wisconsin. And yeah, it's not really like part of the project, but I guess it's part of the way I've been in community with people in those projects. And I'm also not the person doing things in front of the camera. So I think people were feeling as participants pretty animalistic in some of the movements that they were making, both in the Burroughs and Feral Utopias. And that was like kind of part of the guidance that I gave them, was to feel into being in a burrow like an animal. So me and my participants have different experiences. So I think it comes up in different ways.
I feel like this came up earlier too, this idea that like other spaces, they're like, there's this need and also like drive for other spaces where this like utopian building and dreaming can happen. So I feel like it is part of the work. Like the dance floor is part of the work too, even if it's not like directly related to the production of work. I hope you mind me tabbing in to answer this question also. But I'm working with this idea of like dance as a medium for transforming the body and its sort of morphological forms into other bodies, and got to sort of play with this in a variety drag show in Queer Nightlife in New York, and it was this sort of like, I was doing a banana slug transforming into sort of a garden fern. But that wasn't the most animalistic that I felt. It was later that evening watching someone else perform a drag piece that just like really touched me, and like screaming with like everything I had in me, like all of the air in my lungs screaming at once, just like in like rapture, watching this other performance. And like that to me was part of the work too somehow, but that felt like animal. And like I couldn't speak for 3 days afterwards, but like it needed to like come out. But I think that that's sort of like those spaces and those like communities, like you're talking about, Corinne, like there is something animal and so important about them.
Yeah, I think of I don't know. I don't know if I have a good definition of the term animalistic. I think maybe more like embodied for me feels like resonant. And yeah, I think in the one piece in the show where I've collected all these bugs that die on me while I'm running, I think I feel like incredibly embodied in that practice as yeah, like running for me as, especially like in the summer along creek beds, and I'm just like, I feel so both in control and out of control of my body, of I'm like really sweaty and feeling gross, and I'm hitting all these bugs that are dying on me, and some are crawling on me and swallowing different things that are in the air. And you know, that sort of moment of like both life making, of, you know, having such like pleasure and joy in my body, of sort of like making life for like the microbes that are now in my sweat. But I think also sort of life taking, of sort of like killing a bug or sort of stepping on different plant matter, and sort of this like maybe animalistic embodied sort of blending of like what is a living thing, what is a dead thing, but just sort of feeling like materially enmeshed in the world.
All right. I want to close us out with just one final question that's come in, and then we'll have just some quick closing comments. What are some of the consequences of neglecting or disregarding ecology through the lens of queer theory? If anyone has thoughts.
I think it can lead to alienation. I think we're all pretty well versed in alienation from a queer theory, but also from our, some aspects of our experiences. But in geography, we think a lot about, queer geography. Well, some of us do. The discipline at large does not think about queer geographies. But, we talk about this kind of metronormativity where the city is the place, in all these, in the kind of imaginary, the city is the place of being queer, and queerness is kind of impossible in rural spaces or out of place. And that kind of imaginary, alienates and erases queer rural life and cultures. But it also breaks with the kind of ecological, I think. And in our panel, we were thinking about how, that kind of urban not to say there's not nature in cities, right? That's another thing to deconstruct, but like with the dismissal of rural landscapes has also come perhaps, negligence of thinking about landscapes and spaces that are not gay bars or, urban kind of gay spaces. So yeah, I mean, my work like with the Natural History Project, or is that what it's called? Natural History? Yeah, the goat portraits. I actually found it quite surprising because that was a project about affect. It was about trans affect, what kind of affect is possible as a trans person trying to relate to this science and this order of things and this way of knowing. And the whole project I imagined as being pissy and alienated, right? Like I had all my angry stances that I practiced. And as I continued through the project, I knew I had to find some other affect too, but it was much harder to find this kind of sense of mischief or joy or pleasure. So this is all to say that I think queer theory can tend very easily toward alienation. And I think ecology in the sense of both, our grounding in like the environment or natural spaces, but also a kind of emphasis on relationality can help to ground some of the negative affect.
Okay. I think that's a great way to wrap up this conversation. But thank you all so much for your work on this show. And this has been a really fruitful conversation. I've gained a lot just in this past hour. Chatting with you all, having you all in the same space is really wonderful. And I'm really excited for folks to get to engage with the space more in the coming weeks and through some of the programming that's coming up. So I will pass it over to Esther, I think, just to close us out with any announcements or formalities. But thank you all for tuning in. And I hope if you haven't been able to, that you'll be able to get to visit the gallery for a program or for the closing reception as well. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm just going to echo what Shawn was saying, that it's been a really great discussion. It's been really amazing to just sit and listen in and hear your thoughts and just get a deeper insight into what you all do and why you do it. And just for everyone listening, the show closes on April 22nd, which is a Saturday, and we are also having a really fun closing party. So go to our website and check it out, and feel free to get tickets and come. And there's also discount codes. So if you're a Rough Gems artist or curator, you get in for free, Friends of Union Hall discount, and all of that. So I look forward to spending time with you all at that party. And once again, I'll quickly just thank our sponsors, because this obviously wouldn't be possible without the Coloradan Community Foundation, Andy Warhol Foundation, and Colorado Creative Industries, and Bonfi Stanton. So I hope everyone has a lovely evening, and yeah, good night.
Good night, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Esther. Thanks, Shawn. Thanks, Jess.